Welcome to AI Horror Stories. Prepare to be chilled. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell for daily doses of AI-generated fright. The name of the story is Morgue. Let's begin the story. There once was a morgue, in which a series of gruesomely violent murders took place. At the time of the investigation, many thought that it was someone working at the morgue, but I found that theory rather lacking in evidence, and I also knew everyone who worked there, for I too worked there. My name is Dr. Spelding, and I shall tell you the truth of the events that took place at the Roosevelt Morgue in Baltimore, Maryland. It began on a Thursday morning. I arrived at my usual time, which was about 6:15 a.m., to find everything the way it was the day before, when I felt at about 6:15 p.m., which was approximately 45 minutes before sunset. I went into my office and went over with the mail that I found laid out on my desk. Junk, more junk. Just the usual, I thought as I took off my jacket. I got up and proceeded to walk across my office to the coffee maker, which was already brewing. God, thank you for the automatic brewing coffee makers. I was in the middle of pouring my cup of coffee when I heard a blood-curdling scream, which sounded like it was coming down the hall. The surprise at hearing the scream caused me to spill my very hot coffee all over myself. Damn it! I exclaimed, but put down my coffee cup, or should I say half-empty cup, and left my office in a hurry. Sobbing and crying was common in this morgue, i.e. when people come to claim family members, etc., but this week was the first scream I've heard in my 20 years working there. As I ran, I heard another scream, as for a brief moment I thought that someone was being attacked, but then I turned the corner in the hallway and what saw told me that no one was being attacked, at least not at this time. For on the floor was a body. It had been beaten and ripped open, blood was everywhere and intestines were lying in a head by the body, which lay on its side. The neck had a gaping wound in the throat. It was Jimmy, the med student who worked here, was a janitor for his summer job. The screaming came from Samantha, my autopsy assistant, who was in the corner, sobbing and holding her knees to her chest. Throughout the summer I had noticed a flirtatious relationship between Jimmy and Samantha. After all, they were only 3 years apart, and Jimmy was a med school student and Samantha was a med school grad. I carefully stepped around Jimmy's body and made my way to Samantha. After a few minutes I got her to stand and I led her to my office. There I helped her calm down and called the police. The police arrived shortly. 2 marked squad cars, and a black unmarked cruiser. 4 uniform officers and another entered the building. I met them by Jimmy's body. Samantha was still too grieved, so she remained in my office. The officers briefly examined the body, then took my statement. After which they left to get Samantha's statement, leaving me and the detective alone with the body. What do you think, Doc? Detective Geth asked as he casually inspected the blood splatter patterns on the wall beside the body. Geth was in forensics before he became a cop, so naturally I trusted his opinion on things of a forensic nature. I don't know, I replied, striving to be honest. It's very brutish, that's for sure. The not strange thing is I don't see an injury that would equal a cause of death. To be honest, half of what I'm seeing already is confusing me and isn't making sense, and here I've only been on the investigation for maybe 15 minutes. Geth knelt down by Jimmy's throat, or lack thereof. What about this one? He asked as he motioned to the gaping wound in his neck. It appeared that a part of the throat had been removed, yet it didn't appear anywhere. The edges of the wound were jagged and vaguely reminded me of the way a steak looks after being bottom into. Yes, possibly, but the main arteries are still intact. I said, pointing out the main arteries in the neck wood with my latex glove-covered hand. It didn't rupture, and it wasn't torn, so he didn't bleed to death. At least not from here. Geth nodded his head and stooped slowly. All right. Well, I'll have forensics go over the body, then it's all yours, Doc, he said. I agreed. Then he went on to his radio and called in the forensic team. I stood and got out of the way so the forensic team could do their job uninterrupted. They did a very thorough job, checking for prints, fibers, and any powder substances or anything that didn't belong on the body. It took them about 30 minutes, very efficient, very thorough. By then the 4 uniform officers came back from hating Samantha's statement. I went and retrieved the gurney, then Geth helped me get Jimmy onto the gurney. After which the police left and I moved Jimmy into the operating room. As I began to briefly go over the body, I felt a prescience. I felt that I was being watched. I looked up to see Samantha, standing in the doorway, putting on some latex gloves as if she was intending to help me with the autopsy. "Samantha, don't. You don't need to put yourself through any more pain, it's unnecessary," I said as I moved in between her and Jimmy's corpse, trying to block Samantha's view. She just discovered the guy she had been flirting with, and probably had feelings for, brutally murdered nearly an hour ago. Needless to say, I didn't think her performing the autopsy with me on that specific guy would do her any good, only harm honestly. "Harry, don't give me that sympathetic bull. I want whoever did this to rot in jail. You know I'm good at my job, let me help," she said as she snapped her latex gloves on. The look in her eyes told me she was set, and therefore there wasn't any point in arguing further. "All right. Come help me with pre-autopsy examinations first," I said. She came over, her face grave, and we began working, seeking the answers to how Jimmy died, and who was responsible. At nearly 11:30, 4 hours later, we finished the autopsy. Conclusively the cause of death was heart attack, induced by extreme fear and shock which, to say the least, was very unusual for someone his age. He did, however, have a slight heart murmur, but nothing severe enough to cause, or explain, a 22-year-old having a heart attack. Our other findings were that whoever killed him mutilated him post-mortem. This is what I sent to Detective Geth in the autopsy report, which was all 100% true. But, I left several things out, for they were too odd for the detective to bother himself with, and those things are namely, that all of the wounds looked like deep lacerations and bites from animals. For instance, the neck wound, it seemed like a jagged bite, but it looked more like the bite of an animal than a human. Also the skin over the abdominal muscles, along with the abdominal muscles themselves, appeared to be ripped open, not cut. Which made me heavily suspicious if animals, yet that theory didn't make any sense in light of the other evidence. What animal could be so nuttermite terrifying to cause a 22-year-old to go into shock and have a heart failure? Nevertheless, Samantha and I kept it to ourselves. We sat in my office, after having deposited his body into the cooler for future reference, drinking coffee. Our minds ever drifting to the autopsy and the new questions it created. "Do you really think an animal did that to Jimmy?" Samantha asked as she slowly sipped her coffee. I shook my head slowly. I'd been asking myself the same exact thing for nearly 3 hours. "I don't know. It appears like it, but only a cougar, or a wolf, could do that kind of damage. But that neck wound, the bite shape and sizing isn't right for any animal I can think of, it like more like a human bite shape and sizing, but I've never seen a human do anything like that. Not in my 20 years. I replied as I looked out the window thoughtfully. "What about Geth? Shouldn't we tell him?" she asked. When she asked that question I could feel her looking at my face, pleading for an answer. "No," I said, shaking my head, "until we can figure out whatever the hell make those bites and injuries, we keep it to ourselves. Is that understood?" She nodded her head, then went back to drinking her coffee. I could feel the fear, coming from both myself and Samantha. We'd never seen anything remotely similar to this, it in our combined 25 years, her 5 and my 20. It scared both of us, completely out of our wits. Nevertheless, we agreed to keep it to ourselves until we figured it, at least a little, out. After a long drawl of silence I walked over to my phone as called Ben Truman, our second, and primarily backup, M.E., myself being the main me. I told him that I had a body that I needed to focus a lot my attention to, which was the truth, so I asked if he could come in and fill in for me so I could focus on the body. He agreed and I hung up. Samantha asked me what I just did, and I told her. She looked puzzled, as if she didn't understand how what I did would help our present circumstances, so I clarified by telling her exactly what I had in mind. We can research bite wound pictures and such more, and try to nail the crap down. I explained. Her eyes cleared as she realized what I said, then her face hardened. Let's do it, she said, and so we did. Ben Truman came into the office not much later and did the autopsies as the bodies arrived. Today was a slow day, thank God. Samantha and I began our research immediately. We didn't limit ourselves in any way, we took in every resource and opinion we could find. Everything. From animal attack photons, to the different types of no human bite shapes and such. It was annoying, and grueling work. For a lot of times we couldn't guarantee, with 100%, that the pictures were accurate and also precise. Needless to say, with so many pranksters on the internet it made our goal be difficult to achieve, and in general, it made it take a whole lot longer. Many times when we had a very close match, it turned out to be someone's rendition of what a zombie bite might look like. I scoffed at the idea of there being any such thing as undead. It was utterly impossible. Science could, and does, or should I say did, produce significant evidence against the undead. The whole idea was very stupid to me, and Samantha agreed, yet there was a certain look in her eye when she saw the similarity. It was the same loon when a person allows something to be a possibility. Then, finally, we found something, a digital picture of a bite left by someone, who didn't have very nice teeth. It was exact to what Jimmy had. I called Geth. Detective Geth. Homicide. Geth said in answering. Geth, it's Dr. Spelding. I found something that may help your investigation. I replied. At first he was silent, but then he spoke. Go on, Doc, I'm listening. He replied. I could hear his office chair squeak in the background. Either he stopped leaning, or he just started. God, I hope he stopped. He only leans when he's in for a lecture that he doesn't want to hear. Jimmy, the victim I mean. It's about the neck wound. I didn't write anything in the autopsy report on it, because I didn't find anything helpful. Well, Samantha and I, she's my autopsy assistant, the one who found the body, decided to do some research, and we found it. It matches this digital example of what a sever bite would look like from a human with bad, disorderly teeth. I said, finally getting it off my chest. Are you and your assistant sure? He asked. Yes. Beyond any reasonable doubt. I replied. Okay. Thank you, Doc, this helps a bunch. He said. I told him it was no problem, then we said goodbye and hung up. Samantha was there holding another cup of coffee to me. I took it with thanks, and we drank in silence. Later that night I was working on the file on Jimmy. Many things didn't make any sense and I was really bothered by that, so there I was. Looking over the files, again. Only me and Mark, who is our other janitor, were on the premises. He and Jimmy used to switch on and off, like Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays Jimmy would do the janitorial duties. And Mark did Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. We had been on that schedule for 2 years now, but no more. Mark came into my office when he first arrived, to check on me and see if I was alright. Surprisingly, Mark wasn't scared a bit about being there that night. Being curious, I asked him why. How if Soul Sicko tried to bite my throat out, I'd knock his face off with my fist. Especially after what he did to Jimmy. He said, his voice getting quieter when he mentioned Jimmy. I merely nodded my head and he left to continue his janitorial duties. Nearly 30 minutes later I went out to re-examine a wound that caught my eye in Jimmy's file, the tear of his abdominal muscles. So I went into the operating room, which is where we store the bodies in a large steel cabinet that is kept cool. And being extremely tired I pulled open the wrong door and pulled out the wrong tray, which was empty. Amused at myself I began to push the tray back in, but then I realized that there is a white cloth on the tray. It was ripped to shreds. Immediately my mind began racing. I checked the door, it was listed as Francis Dunbar, yet there wasn't a body. Slowly. Slide the tray and then closed the door and literally ran to my office. I closed the door and locked it. Then quickly looked outside to see that Mark was still here, thank God. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number, hoping that I was just seeing things earlier. After all, I was tired, but somehow I just knew I wasn't seeing things. I just knew it. Mark picked up on the second ring. "Sup, Doc?" he said in his usual way. "Mark, could you come straight to my office? There's something that you need to see," I said desperately, hoping, praying that he'd come. "Yeah. Sure, Doc, be there in a few. I need to finish up this mopping stuff real quick," he said. His voice suggested that he was confused, but it didn't hint that he was lying. Approximately 10 minutes later he opened my office door, which I had unlocked after I called him. As soon as he saw me his eyes changed from confusion to worry. Hey Doc, you alright? You don't look so hot," he asked as he walked towards me apprehensively. I nodded my head quickly. "I'm fine, Mark. But there's something that I need to show you," I said as I walked past him, to my office door and opened it with caution, fearful of what may be hiding in the shadows. I slowly walked out into the hallway and Mark followed, obviously confused by my fearful behavior. It wasn't like me, that I'll admit, anyone who knows me could tell you that. Soon we entered the operating room. It was empty, clean and completely quiet. As I walked toward the steel cabinet, I grabbed the log sheet from a small desk. The log sheet contained the dates that every body was checked in, had an autopsy performed on them, and put in the cooler cabinet. "What am I supposed to see?" Mark asked, very confused. I didn't answer. I opened the door that Francis Dunbar was supposed to be behind. I then pulled out the tray which the torn white sheet was on. Mark looked at the white sheet, but he didn't make the connection. "There is supposed to be a body on this tray, Mark. Francis Dunbar should be lying on this tray, but he isn't," I explained. "You sure, Doc? Maybe it's a mistake," he said, trying to make it as if it was nothing. "I'm positive, Mark. Look, we never put a sheet in the tray unless there's a body to cover up, and second, according to this chart, I stopped talking to seek out the victim's name. See, the rel I checked in Francis on Wednesday evening at about 5 o'clock. Mark didn't reply, but his face became ashen. His eyes widened as he thought over what I just said. Finally he simply told me to go home. In fact, he wouldn't take no for answer. He half-ushered half-forced me to my car and made sure I left. I never saw Mark again, at least not alive. The next morning I slept in very late, up to nearly 10 in the morning. My mind was far too occupied with Jimmy's murder, and the events of the previous night to work, so I called in sick. I thought it would be best to stay home, especially with my mind so overly fixed upon the mystery that had been discovered last night, for I believed that I'd only be a hindrance to my colleagues. "There is supposed to be a body on this tray, Mark. Francis Dunbar should be lying on this tray, but he isn't," I explained. "You sure, Doc? Maybe it's a mistake," he said, trying to make it as if it was nothing. "I'm positive, Mark. Look, we never put a sheet in the tray unless there's a body to cover up, and second, according to this chart, I stopped talking to seek out the victim's name. See, the rel I checked in Francis on Wednesday evening at about 5 o'clock. Mark didn't reply, but his face became ashen. His eyes widened as he thought over what I just said. Finally he simply told me to go home. In fact, he wouldn't take no for answer. He half-ushered half-forced me to my car and made sure I left. I never saw Mark again, at least not alive. The next morning I slept in very late, up to nearly 10 in the morning. My mind was far too occupied with Jimmy's murder, and the events of the previous night to work, so I called in sick. I thought it would be best to stay home, especially with my mind so overly fixed upon the mystery that had been discovered last night, for I believed that I'd only be a hindrance to my colleagues. So with that I went into the kitchen and began to make coffee before I set out to make a complete breakfast. Soon my coffee was finished brewing and I poured myself a cup, then began to make some scrambled eggs and toast. As I was cooking my cell phone rang, which was in my front pocket of my jeans. I answered it. "This is Dr. Spelding," I said, trying to sound clear and cheery, yet my mind was anything but clear or cheery. "Harry, it's Samantha," she said breathlessly. The sound of traffic around here came through on the line. She sounded frightened. "Oh. Hello Samantha, what's going on? And where are you?" I said as I continued cooking my breakfast. Honestly, my mind was racing at that point, wondering why she was calling me. "Mark is missing," she replied. Immediately I froze and my face grew grave. "Dr. Truman came into the office this morning. He said that he thought you could use some help after yesterday. He pulled in and saw Mark's truck still there. When he came in there was a lot of blood on the operating room floor. After that he checked and Mark never clocked out last night. Truman called the cops, then me." I was frozen, my mind however was not. It raced, and my heart seemed to stop. I realized how much more important the events of last night became in light of today's happenings. I made a quick decision. "Samantha, where are you?" I asked as I moved the egg pan off the stove, and put the eggs on a plate. It was time to fill her in on everything from last night, but not over the phone, in person would be best. "I'm on my way to your house," she said as she pulled up in front of my house. I could hear the roar of her Jeep through the house. "I hear you," I replied, then hung up. After which I quickly made my way to the front door and opened it to see Samantha climbing out of her Jeep. She walked up the walkway briskly and into my house, then the door closed silently. I led her into the kitchen, where she sat at the breakfast bar. I gave her a cup of coffee, which she took with thanks. Then I proceeded to present her with eggs and buttered toast. I got the same for myself and sat across from her on an old wooden stool. There was a heavy silence, and we ate in silence, neither of us knowing how to break it. Later, after we had completely consumed our food, I deposited the dishes in the sink and suddenly I broke the silence without thought or without even meaning to. "I saw something last night," I said quietly as I sipped my coffee and stared at the counter, my mind ever going to the previous night. My quiet statement must have caught her attention, for when I looked up she was looking at me. A look of curiosity and apprehensiveness hung on her face and beamed from her eyes. "Do I want to know?" she said quietly as she held her cup tightly. I had to stop myself from shaking my head. "You have to know. It's very important, I think, to figuring out this mystery," I said as I walked back and forth in the kitchen, pacing. "And whether you want to know is irrelevant, but it is so unique, or illogical, that I think you won't believe me." She looked at me puzzled, obviously, not understanding the extreme nature of what I saw. "Tell me. If you think it's that important, then it must be," she finally replied. I sighed deeply. "Last night, as you well know, I stayed late at the office, going over Jimmy's file. I felt as if I was missing something. Well, I found the tearing of his abdominal muscles, and it didn't make sense to me, though I had already observed that there was nothing odd or unusual about it, if that is an animal gave the wound. I was simply feeling desperate. Regardless, I went into the operating room, intending to look at Jimmy's body. But I was so tired that I opened the wrong door on the cooler and put the wrong tray. The tray was empty, yet there was a white cloth on the tray that was ripped to shreds. After checking, I learned that a Francis Dunbar was supposed to be on that tray, since I myself deposited him there on Wednesday night. Yet his body was missing. I showed Mark, but I'm not sure he believed me. After I showed him, he made me leave and go home. I guess he thought I was losing it from not having enough sleep. I said, further explaining my point of how important it was. Samantha sat in her seat, mouth agape, eyes filled with shock. I looked down at my coffee cup that I held in my hand, silently debating whether I should tell her my true hypothesis or the one a person would expect from a learned doctor. Well, truly, my opinion is this. 1. The coincidence that I put Francis in then cooler than that night Jimmy is brutally murdered, and then also the immense animal-like characteristics of his wounds are too great to ignore. 2. Every single digital diagram of an undead bite are far too similar to Jimmy's wounds to simply be coincidence. So, I think it's the undead, or something similar. It's the only way half of the hings would make sense. I said, really sticking my neck out by making such an insane claim, though I am perfectly sane. Samantha nodded her head after remaining silent for a time. Me too. Especially in light of a corpse disappearing, and Mark going missing. It'd be just like him to go investigate a little, whether he believed you or not. Samantha replied. I nodded my head in agreement. There was silence for more time, but then Samantha spoke first. So, what now? She asked. I smiled, for I knew just what to do. Now we find out how to kill the undead the best, and most efficient way, then go get what we need to do that. We're gonna end this tonight, before it spreads and becomes like an epidemic. I said in reply to her question. Samantha seemed to like the idea. Let's do it, boss. She said in a very bad imitation of a Wild West cowboy or cowgirl. I laughed and we went to my computer to do the research. After all, med school grads are great at research. Not too much later we were in her Jeep, heading towards the nearest hardware and outdoor/hunting stores. A copy of the shopping lists lay safe in out pockets. Before we came to the hunting and other stores, I stopped by my bank and took out $500 cash, so that our purchases would be much harder to trace. As we went through the hardware and hunting stores, we went straight to the blades. Axes, hatchets, machetes, even some curries. Finally we were ready. Our shopping list had all been fulfilled. We went back to my house to suit up and get ready for tonight's insane, and rather unconventional, plan. I emerged from my room wearing some black work pants and a long-sleeve plain black shirt. On my right side hung a heavy-duty hatchet, on my left side hung a deadly ice pick used for scaling ledges of ice in the Arctic areas and such, and finally on my back was a large machete. The opening of the bathrooms caught my attention. I looked to see Samantha walk out of the bathroom dressed in all black, with her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. On her left side hung a tomahawk, on her right was a short machete, and other her back were two curries. She looked like a undead hunter. We didn't speak but only nodded, then we went out to her Jeep and sped off, each of us remaining silent, our minds on what we were about to do, and on the very real possibility that tomorrow it be our bodies that are discovered. After a short and silent drive, we pulled up into the parking lot. Samantha looked at me as sat in her Jeep. Ready? She asked. I nodded my head firmly, a serious expression on my face. Yes. Let's get this done. I said as I quietly exited the Jeep, and she did the same. And there we stood. The next few minutes would change us forever, and haunt one of us forever. We decided to leave the keys in the ignition in case only one of us got out. We entered through the front door, which I unlocked with my key. Each of us kept our faces down as to avoid having them seen by the security cameras. Once we were inside, we each took out a weapon. I took out my larger machete and Samantha pulled out her curries. We decided to start in the operating room, so we began making our way towards the hallway that led there. On our way down the darkened hallway we bumped into something big and cold. We shone a light quickly and saw it was Dr. Truman. He had been killed just like Jimmy had, guts spilled, and throat ripped open. After a few moments, we moved on, noting that yet another victim had fallen into the clutches of the horror, towards the operating room. As we neared the operating room, we heard some sort of commotion from inside, the clanging of metal instruments falling to the ground and mindless, evil groaning. The thud of heavy footsteps worked their way around inside the operating room. We slowed our pace, almost instinctively, as there wasn't any conscious decision to walk slower, at least there wasn't for me, yet walk slower we did. About the same time the door to the operating room came into view through the darkness, we saw a pair of hands punch through the glass with a shatter and the glass tinkled as they fell onto the ground. Then the door was pushed open and we saw a dark figure walking through the doorway, and turn towards us with a haunting groan that echoed through the dark hallway. I strained to see it, but I was shocked when I saw who it was. Mark, good old-natured, headstrong Mark. I was frozen in terror and fear, my machete in my arm lay defenseless against my leg. Suddenly I was pushed to the side and Samantha sliced the undead Mark with her curries, successfully decapitating it with odd ease. The head rolled and hit my shoe, eyes staring up at me with a look of murderous rage and insanity. The body jerked around for a few moments, in which Samantha spilled its intestines and nearly cut it in half, but then it fell down with a heavy thud. The undead was now completely dead. Samantha looked up at me, eyes questioning. "You all good?" she whispered hoarsely. I nodded and stepped off the wall. As I opened my mouth to reply there was a flash as something came behind Samantha and there was a terrible sound of ripping flesh and Samantha screamed out in anguish. A decayed arm stuck out from her midsection and her blood poured out. She tried to turn her head but whatever it was, probably the undead, began to bite out her throat. There was terrifying gargling sound as she tried to speak, but only blood flowed from her mouth, just as it did from her throat. Again I found myself frozen, and I feared it would last too long, but then as sudden as it took me it vanished as a vapor. I raised my machete and brought it down on the head of the undead as it threw Samantha's body to the side. The blade cleaved clean through the skull down into the middle of the neck. I pulled it out with a jerk then swung with anger and vengeance in my mind with a yell. The blade cut through the neck and severed the diced head from the rest of its wretched body. It jerked around for a few moments just as the undead Mark did earlier, and then fell with a heavy thud. I fumbled with my flashlight and at first I didn't think I'd be able to open it, but finally I unclasped it and pulled out my flashlight. The undead that killed Samantha was Jimmy, her flirt buddy, her crush. Now even though I deal with dead every day, I've never seen anyone, a friend or foe, die in front of me. When I saw Samantha killed something inside my mind snapped and I killed everyone in the building, even Samantha once she turned to the undead. The horrors that I witnessed that night have never left me, and still haunt my dreams. After killing everyone, alive or dead, or undead, in the morgue I set it on fire, intending to end this horror, now and forever, once and for all. I stood by her jeep as I watched the flames consume the morgue. After a while I got into her jeep, started the jeep with the keys that we had earlier left in the ignition, then I drove. I drove far, far away.